Near the end of 2012, I found myself excited about and energized by the uncertainty of the upcoming year. My girlfriend Laura and I knew that we would be leaving the United States soon to embark on a backpacking journey through South America. I hoped that ejecting myself from the daily grind of adult life in the United States would allow me the time to do some soul searching and, in the process, dig myself out of a mild quarter-life crisis. I'd found in the past that expanding my perspective through travel typically led me to a greater appreciation of the things in my life. Before embarking on this adventure that I hoped would help me discern my future, I was unexpectedly forced to face the reality of my past. The scene that morning was a familiar one to me. I was spending the remaining days of the year at my mother's country home in western Illinois. I sat at the kitchen table, rubbing sleep from my eyes while sipping hot coffee and eating breakfast with my mother and Laura. The conversation was typical for the setting, a blend of light-hearted catching up and cynical social commentary, until we reached a point where I could tell something wasn't right. Looking across the table, I noticed that my mother was choked up and needed to get something off her chest. She told me that I should sit down, that she'd been waiting for years for the right time to tell me something she felt that I deserved to hear. She told me, through tears, that the man I had been calling Dad for my entire life wasn't actually my biological father. After a minute or so of shared tears, she finally pulled herself together to offer an explanation. About 30 years ago, my parents decided to adopt my brother Zach from South Korea because of infertility issues. And near the end of that lengthy process, my mother decided that additionally she wanted a biological child. She sought out a fertility clinic in Davenport, found a suitable donor, and brought me into the world 9 months later. Blown away by the newly discovered complexity of my origins, I felt my tears dry up quickly. Though she felt better after breaking the news to me, she felt overwhelmingly guilty for waiting so long to tell me. I sat with that for a short while before coming back with something that I hoped would soothe her heavy heart and conscience. Late in high school and early in college, I was obsessed with the Mars Volta, a progressive rock band, and in particular, their concept album entitled Francis the Mute. I was initially attracted to the bombastic drumming, fret wizardry on the guitars, ever-changing time signatures, and cryptic bilingual lyrics. It's an album so layered that you can listen to it 100 times and still pick out previously unheard parts. Having done just that, I decided to parse through the lyrics to find out what could possibly be meant by lines such as umbilical syllables left to decode and only these names I clutch will lead me to my home. The lyrical content can be traced to a diary that a member of the band found in the backseat of a derelict car while working as a repo man. He thumbed through it and discovered a story of an adopted boy who was separated from his biological parents and his subsequent travels in search of the meaning of family and his place in the world. Being adopted and having wrestled with similar issues himself, the band member was so intrigued by the contents of the diary that he took it to the group's main songwriters to see what they thought about using it as inspiration for some new tunes. What resulted was an album that details the boy's journey while leaving plenty of room for speculation as to what he encountered and learned along the way. Fans of the band have drastically different interpretations of the series events and the meaning behind it all, but here's what I took from it. I believe the protagonist comes to realize that it is his connection to everyone he meets throughout his travels that is meaningful, that his family consists of all the people who love and support him, and that his new idea of family is one that transcends our human biology. I explained this to my mother. I explained to my mother that I had been trying to live this concept for years, and that the news she shared would only serve to make my future efforts feel more meaningful and tangible. It isn't unlikely that my interpretation of the story differs from the artist's intent, but ultimately that is of little importance. What is important is that what I took from the story served as the impetus for the evolution of my understanding of the idea of family and has aided me in processing what may have otherwise been hard news to swallow. In the absence of this interpretation, I can only imagine how I would have reacted to the news my mother gave me that morning. Perhaps I would have felt resentment towards both my parents for lying to me for my whole life, Instead, I feel empathy for a mother who struggled for years to find the right time and manner to share such delicate information with her son. And I'm grateful for having a father who is capable of loving and raising two boys who don't share his genes. All this appreciation and understanding stems from our potential as humans to evolve ideas. Great minds have been evolving ideas throughout history by taking bits of existing knowledge, filtering them through our subjective lens of experience, and updating them to better fit our modern understandings. I first heard the term used by Bill Hicks, the late comedian and social commentator, when he argued for a more compassionate approach of treating drug users as patients in need of medical treatment rather than criminals deserving punishment. For me to say this idea stemmed from a personal experience of his would be speculation on my part, though not a far-fetched one. However, I think others have come to conclusions similar to mine, undoubtedly through their own very personal experiences. For example, after several failed commercial ventures that stood to only benefit his immediate family, the 20th century designer and inventor R. Buckminster Fuller realized that, quote, "The larger the number for whom I worked, the more positively effective I became. Thus, it became obvious that if I worked always and only for all humanity, I would be optimally effective." Likewise, upon departing from a private American company that had been subverting democracy with state-encouraged economic warfare throughout the undeveloped world, John Perkins, author of the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, offered the following insight. "We are a very, very small world. I'm very aware of the fact that my grandson cannot possibly hope to inherit a sustainable, peaceful, stable, socially just world unless every child today growing up in Ethiopia, Indonesia, Bolivia, Palestine, and Israel also has that same expectation." Though our frames of reference vary, the process of evolving ideas led us to the same feeling of connectedness. When we allow the vast ocean of experience to wash over us, we open ourselves to life in a way that ensures moments when we deeply feel our connection to one another. And when we feel that connection, we can expect our love to dissolve boundaries and for our ideas to evolve with us. Families get bigger, the world gets smaller, and the word service is redefined. For if we all are connected, there is no other. There is no us. There is no them. There is only we. The 99%? No, we are the 100%. When you recognize that we're all in this together, you know that when you serve others, you are servicing yourself, your family, your community, and your world. Again, in the words of Bill Hicks, evolution did not end with us growing thumbs. We're at the point where we're going to have to evolve ideas.
This is a pretty young crowd out here this morning, but some of the older people in the crowd may remember that I used to work at this church. It was a lovely job, and I got to interact with many of you, grew personally in various ways, and felt privileged to be here. But in some ways, I felt a little like Goldilocks. It was a close fit, but not quite right. I still felt a higher calling. I felt the need to work with, and don't take this the wrong way, plants. When I was first introduced to the UU principles, the one I felt most aligned with was the seventh principle, the interdependent web one. I grew up in that web, that out-of-doors, sacred, physical web, way before there was even a UU understanding in my life. And that web was calling my name. Some friends and I were driving the northern Iowa countryside once and came across an Amish farm that was selling homemade goodies. We stopped, chatted a while, purchased a few items, and went on. One of my friends who had not grown up on a farm had observed the children of the Amish couple, who had been curiously observing us in their tattered straw hats and worn overalls. She lamented how poor they were. She wanted to remedy that by going into town and purchasing new straw hats. For a minute I wondered, how could I have not noticed how in need they were? And then I knew. I had thought they were rich. I saw in them the scenario of how I grew up on a farm in Oklahoma, poor perhaps in material ways, but in the experience on that farm, the run of the out-of-doors, happy, well-fed, loved, rich. When I left the farm of my youth in the rearview mirror, eager to get out in the world on my own, I went where any curious, nature-loving person might go to study the sciences at the university. The best part of that was meeting my husband John there, but that's another story. Afterwards, I worked a few years in laboratories and learned that dissecting nature into her component parts was not my passion. Goldilocks was uncomfortable. Something was missing. The spirit of it was missing, the sacred. To come closer to finding that spirit, I stayed at home to raise our daughters and then came to work at this church. But that desire to work with plants kept niggling me, and so back to the university. It was like a pendulum, swinging between science and religion and science, and finally landing right in the middle on my own farm, the most spiritually rich, open-hearted place I could be. Goldilocks had found the perfect fit. This farm, this out-of-doors wonderland, is where I got to play for the next 17 years. I loved being a caretaker for this soil that was entrusted to me. But the first signs of an unbalanced rural landscape arrived like a sledgehammer. Green beans were skeletonized by bean beetles, cucumber beetles devouring other crops to the ground. Welcome to farming beyond the protected confines of urban areas. It wasn't hard to figure out the bean beetles' problem. They were awaiting the soybeans' emergence, and our green beans were just a tasty appetizer. So we learned to plant later in the season. The cucumber beetle imbalance was a harder puzzle to solve until I learned from an entomologist that the larval stage of the cucumber beetle, that's the stage before it becomes a beetle, is a southern corn rootworm. The imbalances all made sense now among the sea of corn and soybeans of Iowa. Humans have characterized villains and heroes in nature, the weeds and the crops, the bad bugs and the good bugs. But they all have a place, even if we haven't discovered it yet. Weeds can bring up nutrients from the deep in the earth or have flowers that feed insects. The nutrients in the edible weeds lamb's quarter, purslane, and nettles far surpass the nutrients in many of the vegetables that we so carefully tend. The bad bugs or pests have a role as food for the good bugs. Many of these beneficial insects eat or lay their eggs in pests. They often eat flowers for food, and of course a landscape without pesticides, which can destroy them and their food source. I tell anyone who will listen not to kill a tomato hornworm that you might find in your garden that has little white eggs on its back, as this worm has already been parasitized, and killing the worm kills not only the pest, which is doomed anyway, but the beneficial babies. I love the snakes on the farm. They help control rodents. I've never seen a snake eat a mouse, but I know that they do, at least that's what we're always told. One day a bull snake had gotten caught in some bird netting, which we used at the farm to protect some crops from deer. They can get their heads through, but not the rest of their body. I like to call it snake vanity. A farm crew member and I proceeded to carefully cut it out, as we occasionally had to do. Before we could finish, that frightened snake opened its mouth wide and regurgitated a mouse before our very eyes. Still fully intact, hair, tail, and all. And as we were wide-eyed looking at each other at what we had just witnessed, the snake proceeded to open wide and regurgitate a second mouse. Slightly more digested, but still a whole mouse. What an illustration of balance and action. We think we saved that snake's life even if she lost her breakfast. And the interdependent web stories could go on and on. The best part of all this knowledge and experience was introducing it to others, sharing this bounty of the earth, this education, this connection of the earth with others, even when people didn't want to hear about the secret life of snakes and mice and bugs. Rachel Carson said, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction. It felt good to be on the cusp, taking responsibility for the land, for the food I ate and fed our children, to be a part of this resurgence in responsible food growing, providing habitat. But there is still much to learn and to do and to question. This takes energy and work. It's often easier to go with the flow and not change. My initial use of pesticides in our home garden many years ago paralleled that of my father as I had watched him do while growing up. It is worthwhile to examine why we do the things we do. As a chemistry major, but more importantly as a mother, I examined my use of pesticides in our home garden and questioned it. I changed. I have hope that others can change too. It's hard to watch many of the developments in farming, many of them done for short-sighted or dubious reasons. For example, when the delicious apple was discovered in Winterset, Iowa, it was a sport. That's a horticultural term for an aberration that occurs naturally in nature. And it was delicious. We are lucky to have in our home orchard an ancestor from a cutting of that tree. But then plant breeders took this delicious but somewhat homely-looking apple into the beauty parlor laboratory for improvements. The result was the apple that you see in grocery stores today that is big, bright red, and beautiful, but in my opinion, no longer very delicious, even though that is still its name. In the process of striving for beauty, size, shippability, or flavor, while no one has been looking or thinking, the nutritional value of some of our food has gone into the basement. Jo Robinson, in her book, Eating on the Wild Side, relays that the original wild apples had hundreds to 1,000 times the amount of phytonutrients as modern-day apples do. Martin Prechtel, in his book, The Unlikely Peace at Cuchamaquac, writes of an indigenous Mayan Indian tribe in Guatemala that endured an earthquake that demolished their town, their food supply, and many residents. It was days before food arrived. The leader of the tribe carried an important satchel with him at all times. In this bag was the corn seed that was unique to this tribe and region that had fed them for hundreds of years. Even though people were starving, no one thought of cooking up this sacred small supply of their seed culture. They knew it would need to be grown out for years to be able to feed this tribe again. I long for my food, for your food, to be treated as sacred all along its journey from seed to farm to plate, to be honored, respected, loved. Researchers are finding that even babies are using what they are calling the Goldilocks effect. In this research from the University of Rochester, babies were found to ignore things that were too simple or too complex, focusing instead on situations that were just right. It is believed that this was a way that they learned to deal with the world with complex sights, sounds, and movements. When I get on information overload or become distressed about the environmental damaged state of our earthly home, I can feel overwhelmed and paralyzed into inaction. Sometimes I cannot take it all in, and my heart wants to put up a wall for protection. I, like the babies with the Goldilocks effect, continue to work to find the path through my heart that lets me deal with life in small steps where I can make a difference. Being Goldilocks is not necessarily comfortable or easy, just this is the open-hearted, sacred spot where I am called to be. I give myself permission not to have to save the whole complex world, but rather just to save one bug, one snake, or one farm at a time. Thank you.